of three talks I'm giving for Bosler. The first was on William Homer Ames, the legendary librarian who sort of kept the library going for almost half a century in the first half of the 20th century. The second was on the Lila Memorial Window, which I hope you all have taken a little look at since the talk. And this one is a subject way too large for the time and very justified attention span you may have. It's about, there's a 1,000 different ways, as Kipling would have said, to tell the Bosler story, about the family from the 1830s to, you can even bring it up to the present day. I am not doing that this evening. There, I hope, is a book underway by a local historian named Christine Musser, who's been working on it for some decades, and I cannot approach her mastery of the detail or her thorough understanding of the Bosler family. I have been interested in the Boslers since the 1980s when I went to Dickinson, and the picture you see before you is a reason why I've been interested in the Boslers. And I've been talking about them since about the centennial time, roughly turn of the century. What I'm going to do is approach them in a very specialized way to offer up to you three facets of Bosler history that, to me, make a unity. But first, I'm going to start with a recent story that made a very deep impression on me. And I've already asked one member of the audience, you have to confess, was anybody here at Presbytery last month at First Presbyterian Church? And I know John wasn't. You were. Okay. Yeah, you were conspicuous by your absence, sir.
Well, thank you for pointing
yes,
that
out. So I'm sorry I'm going to repeat the story.
That's okay, because the microphone to the kitchen was turned off.
Oh. You were doing all the important work. Okay, the rest of us were just fooling around in the sanctuary, so okay. Very sorry to hear that. In mid-September, before Presbytery, obviously, I gave a talk at Presbytery. This is why I'm vetting you all out as potential activist Presbyterians. I gave a talk that addressed the early settlement of the valley in the 1700s. And it was in relation to, it was sort of a sneaky campaign to get up to the issue which may be shortly addressed or may already be addressed by Presbytery on the issue of land statements. If you don't know what land statements they are a recently very popular movement toward acknowledging a form of history of the place where you are, sort of like geography, tip of the hat. And a lot of land statements will start out with saying, we acknowledge that we are on, stolen land from the Susquehannocks, et cetera, et cetera. And they, sort of apologize and so forth. I have sort of a divided issue on land statements, but I'll explain as part of the story. And before Presbytery last month, I was visited by two men and a woman who came here as a part of a representative delegation for the repatriation of Indian school students who are in the little Indian cemetery at the south end of the Carlisle barracks. Came into the store, striking man that I dealt with first, built like a football player. I mean, this guy was big. He was broad shoulders, built like a door, and had this wonderful, my wife would have envied it, this wonderful braid that stretched down to the base of his back. and sort of silver and black hair going down. And he wore this very dramatic T-shirt, and it said, you know, edit this for our family audience, it said, if you're not a Dallas Cowboys fan, you should eat shingles. Something like that. And I knew immediately that I was in the presence of natives. Remember, I am trained to judge a book by its cover. These three people looked entirely, to me, you know, classic Native American look profile. And certainly the big guy was, I mean, he could have been right out of central casting for Dance with Wolves or whatever. And he's the one who wore a Dallas Cowboys shirt. And it turns out he was a terrific Dallas Cowboys fan, which I found a certain irony in. He asked about books for the Carlisle Indian School, and he and I discussed exactly what he was after, because that's kind of a broad subject and there's not very many comprehensive, easy histories. And I told him about a very academic-y one, then I told him about a biography of sports Indians and so forth, and he went for the one about the athletes. As I talked with him, the other two became involved in the conversation, and we all began talking football, which was interesting. I said that, you know, anything west of the Susquehanna in Pennsylvania is considered Steelers territory, which was greeted with great derision by the other man, who's a Cleveland Browns fan. And I said anything east of the river is considered Eagles territory, and they dismissed that as not worth paying attention to. I'm talking to a Cowboys fan. And then we were kicking this all around, and I said, you know, the Redskins used to play here, and I was testing them to see, you know, I said, now of course we all know them as Commanders. And the one other man, who was the Cleveland Browns fan, said, I liked Redskins better. That had such better feel, and said, yeah, I'm a Redskins fan and we scalped ya. And I thought, this is an interesting group. I like this. This is good. And I said, well, and I told them about the days when the Redskins used to train here, and we used to have the dance kids here, so we'd have huge football players and tiny little bunheads walking up and down the street. And they enjoyed that image. And when I satisfied the big Cowboys fan, he left to go out to the car for something, and the woman came up, and she had bought the scholarly book and a couple other books, so this is all making the bookseller in me very happy, but these are very interesting conversations as well. And the Cleveland Browns fan came up and said, where did your Choctaw husband go? And I thought, okay. I said, well, if he's Choctaw, you're making a distinction, right? And he said, oh yeah, sure, I'm Cheyenne, he's Choctaw, and this woman here is a Sac Fox. We're all from Oklahoma. And I said, well then our football discussion is really interesting then. And she looked at me, she was at the counter at that point, she looked at me and she said, yeah, you know when those two guys talk football, they can't say anything to me. And I said, because Jim Thorpe was a Sac Fox. And she said, yes. In other words, you can't talk, you can't tease, you can't taunt a Sac Fox because you had the greatest athlete of the 20th century, which I thought was very interesting on a competitive level. And then when I said, but back to you, I said to the Cleveland Browns fan, who's a Cheyenne, I said, you'd call him a Choctaw because I know you guys have a word to call yourselves, the Cheyenne, human beings, implying that everyone else is not. And he said, oh yeah, what's the problem with that? And I said, so you do draw a distinction? And he says, well, there's a distinction to be made. Which is, again, I'm learning a lot of interesting, what are called emic inside the culture. And finally, after all the football chatter, after all the how do you identify yourself as a native chatter and so forth, our discussion came around to the reason why they were in Carlisle. And I said that I was really impressed. I said, I'm an Army brat, and I said, let me tell you, I'm really impressed with the Department of Defense's, that's when back was the Department of Defense. I said, the Department of Defense's whole cooperation in this. I said, they've been amazing. And the Cheyenne guy, who does have a kind of a wry sense of humor, he said, yeah, well, it took them long enough, but we do deeply appreciate how cooperative they've been. And all three of them, the big guy was back by then, the Cowboys fan, and he said, you know, they've been really good and very helpful and so forth. And I said, well, I'm pleased by that, because I think this is a good thing. And the Cheyenne guy, they were all turning to leave by that time. The Cheyenne said, referencing the children, he said, whatever may have happened, he said, it's time to go home. And I thought that was one of the most beautiful statements about the whole repatriation process that I have encountered. And they were just going out the door, Cowboys fan leading the way, of course, clearing the path. And I said, you know, today we've had a Choctaw, Sac Fox, and a Cheyenne here. I said, there's been a lot of power in the store today. And the Cheyenne guy laughed. He says, yeah, that's how we think of it too. And then he left. I told that story in Presbytery because then I wanted to offer to them a way how you've got to get in the other side of cultural guilt, of cultural obligation, of knowing, of thinking you know something, of assuming you know something. And I offer it to you today because it really affected my recent sense of history. History is more malleable, it's more organic, it's more situational than names, dates, and dictates and fashions of how history ought to be told. In other words, no matter what history I could offer to you of Bosler, there's yet another version to give you. And I am not here to take 40 minutes of your time and try to offer you all the versions. I'm just going to try to keep it simple in slices of things that I have perceived in talking about Boslers for 40 years. It comes down to storytelling, in a sense. Because I'm getting very concerned, since Logan has already pointed out my advancing age.
Sorry.
I'm starting to get a little concerned about all the stories I know, about all the stories I've told. 20 years I did the fall history series at Cumberland County Historical Society. Many of you were here for there, and I see Don Booth saying, yes, I know, I can recall every single one you gave over 20 years. But I repeated the framework of the talk. In other words, I did it chronologically from the 18th century to the present. But I never repeated a story in 20 years of either 6 or 8 sessions of multiple stories within those sessions. There are thousands of stories that I did research on and that I made presentations on, including the Boslers over time. And what happens, I ask myself, what happens to stories when storytellers are gone? I am sometimes teased, I think because of the increasing whiteness of my beard, I am sometimes teased about, well, so what's your retirement plan? I don't have a retirement plan. And I often tell people that I'll be slumped over the counter and the Mulan the cat will be kneading me on my back saying, when do I get fed next? But I doubt, frankly, I know, I'm pretty sure that Whistle Stop will not continue after I'm gone. Whistle Stop will be gone. And so the stories I offered, the guidance I offered within Whistle Stop are all ephemeral. I hope you enjoy the books. I hope people enjoy the books I offer, and I hope that in small ways changes their lives. But that's going to be gone, and something will arise to displace it. you'll all have little AI bots telling you stories that keep you happy or something like that. But I'm interested in if history is inevitably about the present in which it is written. Any history you read is affected by the time in which it is written or which it is told. Like tonight. It's affected by what I've taken in recently. For instance, the Carlisle Presbyterian meeting with the Native Americans. As the time it purports to record, describe, animate, what happens to the history of what happened and why it happened? In other words, if history changes so much, how do you get it simple? How do you keep it clear enough that later generations can still play with it? In 30 years, when Logan's giving these talks, what can we offer him that he could still play with the history of the library at its 150th or more into the future? Well, one way you can do it, and I know you think, finally, he's getting around to it. One way you can do it is through artifacts. So I'm going to offer you 3 artifacts for tonight's story of the Boslers. It will seem to cover only a narrow stretch. Scene. Artifact 1. Has any of you ever seen this before? I'm so relieved to hear that. It is in the official custody of the Dickinson College archives. I discovered it when I was an undergraduate at Dickinson, I worked in the archives and I also did research in the archives, and came upon this chair and I said, this is fabulous, this is so cool. Remember, when I was 5 years old, I loved to play the cowboy, and I often had to play the Indians as well because my brothers were too old, so I had both cowboys and Indians. But I thought this was great. The various archivists over the years, and certainly the wonderful current one, Jim Gerencer, always roll their eyes when I praise this chair, because they don't know what to do with it. They have finally have a wonderful director of the library, whose name is Amy Ward, who keeps this in her office. God bless her. Because I threatened Jim Gerencer. I said, don't you ever get rid of that chair. Or if you do, it comes to Bosler. Which you can imagine how Linda Rice and then Jeff Swope would roll their eyes and say, where are we going to put it? Everybody sees it as sort of a dust accumulator or something. I don't see that. But Amy Ward keeps this in her office. It is what I call a Bosler chair. It comes from sometime in the 1880s. And it was given to Gertrude Bosler Biddle, the daughter of our noble benefactor J. Herman Bosler, as a wedding present by one of her many brothers. No one knows which brother. I have a sneaking suspicion, and this name will come up again, James Williamson Bosler, her older brother, gave it to her as a wedding present when she married Edward Biddle. The reason why they gave it to her is part of the Bosler story. But what does it mean? If you're an American Studies guy like me, if you had parents who dabbled with antiques in their retirement, you always got to figure out what these material artifacts mean. It is obviously a symbol, it's a stunt. It's a symbol of power and exploitation of the prairies and the cattle industry. It's called a Texas steer chair because the horns come from Texas steers. The only way that Texas steers got up into Bosler country in the west was coming from Texas on drives. Usually they were being driven like with and so forth to railroad centers like Kansas and so forth. But this is where the prairie herds of cattle were stocked by Texas cattle. So this came from the area where the Bosler brothers were running a big cattle operation. They thought, oh, wouldn't our sister Gertrude really love one for her wedding? Yes, imagine her excitement when she was given this. Now, I don't know about the females in this room, But my sense is that none of you look at that and think, oh, what a comfortable chair I'd love to throw myself back into, right? It is not meant for human consumption, basically. It's designed to be dramatic, it's designed to be funny, it's designed to be, oh, no other household in Carlisle has one of these. Currently, this is a big, by the way, a fashion thing in the West. You can buy them, and they go up at auctions and auction houses for roughly about $1,000 to $10,000, depending on how fancy you get them and what condition they're in. As you can see, this is in superb condition except for the upholstery. I am going to torment Jim Gorenser by saying, you know, I'm going to apply for a grant to get this reupholstered, which will make me persona non grata, but I know Amy Ward will support me on this. It's not functional. It's very low. I defy any of you to sit in it comfortably. But it's a powerful symbol. It's a symbol of we have mastered the prairies, and we have mastered it with cattle. Why all this cattle stuff? What does a family in Carlisle have to do with this? Abram Bosler, who's considered the patriarch of the Bosler clan, he's 1800s. He's the father. Also, every Bosler family had many children, but he's the guy of whom everyone in Carlisle of any consequence in the Bosler clan come from Abram. So Abram was a farmer. That's it. He's a Cumberland County farmer. And he got into growing grain and corn and oats. And what you do when you do that in the 19th century is you also set up a distillery. It's very efficient. This is one of the reasons why we had a whiskey rebellion. I won't get into that. But when you liquefy your agricultural product, you can make it more valuable and you can ship it more easily and further, and it'll be in high demand. Abram knew that. He became very wealthy by becoming a distiller as well as a farmer. His sons, having the luxury of their father's wealth, and growing up in the mid-19th century, looked west, as did the rest of the country. Pretty much I'm going to stick to 4 names. I promise I won't throw you a lot and I won't throw you dates. But John Herman Bosler, our noble beneficiary of that money that was eventually passed on by his wife to form the library. John Herman was the senior son. Then there was James Williamson Bosler. You've heard him mentioned already. I suspect that James Williamson was the troublemaker who gave this chair to his sister. Or maybe all the brothers got in on it. And then there was Joseph Bosler. He's important. And then there was a guy named George Morris Bosler. There were other members of the family, and of course there were children who died young and so forth. But those are the 4 names. John Herman, you notice all the J's. John Herman, James Williamson, Joseph, and then George Morris. All of these sons dabbled in Dickinson Prep, dabbled in Dickinson College. Most of them did not finish. They all got into the business of the dad and investing the money elsewhere. The transition of Bosler boys who moved to the frontier usually started in a little bit in western Pennsylvania, a little bit in West Virginia, a lot in Ohio. Then you sort of quickly moved fast west. Missouri, Kansas, Omaha, Nebraska especially, and then eventually ending up in Wyoming. John Herman, in particular, extended this Bosler empire to California. He bought land in a rather prescient way of territory south of San Francisco. Imagine the money involved here. Now, you could say, well, land was cheap in all the places they went to, but they're the ones smart enough to buy into it. They got into railroads, they got into banks, they got into mining, they got into cattle raising, they got into real estate speculation. Whatever needed money and whatever had good payback, the four Bosler brothers got involved with. They had a touch. And John Herman, who were named, was the quietest, canniest one of them. James Williamson was the most flamboyant and high profile, and he got into politics and hung out with all sorts of powerful Democrats in the 19th century. But John Herman was the one who was the engine of the four brothers. At one point, they had 150 miles of river frontage in Nebraska. Now that means the 150 miles of river frontage, and then you own the land back beyond that. 150 miles, is that here to Baltimore? It's probably a little more than that, right? Imagine that. That's the size of the West. That's the size of the Bosler ambitions. They had immense vision, but at the same time, they were not ones to strap on the old 6 guns and walk into Dodge and throw their weight around. They were much more interested in making money. And so that's what you could imagine them, what Carnegie and Frick did to Western Pennsylvania, these boys were doing out west in a whole nother business. They, when John Herman would make trips out west, which he did on a regular basis to look into his investments, at whatever railroad station he stopped at that had any population, and there's a famous incident in Omaha, where he was mobbed like a rock star. Sorry to throw in that anachronism there. But he was mobbed like a rock star by the press. And this was the press of the San Francisco papers and the Texas papers and the New York papers and the Philadelphia papers. Everybody wanted to know what John Herman Bosler thought about the future of this and the future of that. And that what we now call the Sage of Omaha, Warren Buffett, was preceded by John Herman Bosler in the same place in Omaha. It's hard to recreate the thrill that the Bosler family of little old Carlisle, PA, was creating out west. The chair came back in the height of all this as a gift to Gertrude Bosler Biddle, who was John Herman's daughter, and she was marrying Edward Biddle. Remember that name, because the Biddles, as some of you know from your American history, are Philadelphians. First president of the National Bank of the U.S., who fought Andrew Jackson tooth and nail, was a Biddle. Biddle money is still in Philadelphia. It never left. Like a lot of Philadelphia money, it doesn't leave. And Biddles are still there. That Biddle clan had a branch, a little tiny little offshoot in Carlisle, and Gertrude married into it. So you have Bosler money marrying into Biddle money, which is a thing to think about. But when she got married to Edward Biddle, she got this present. I have a sneaking suspicion it was all James Williamson's idea, but probably the 3 other brothers got involved in it, and they all thought it was quite funny. It remained in the Biddle house, which is currently still standing at the northwest corner of College and West High Street, part of Dickinson College campus. It remained in it there till 1946. Now, at that point, Edward Biddle had died. He died in the 1930s. Gertrude Bosler Biddle, who served as the president of the board of directors of Bosler Library until 1945, had left to go to Ardmore, Pennsylvania. She was failing badly, poor in health, poor in mental acuity, shall we say, and she just entirely removed herself from Carlisle life to be closer to children and grandchildren who are also clustering around Philadelphia again. You see the shifts of things. In 1946, the year after she left, she didn't die until 1950, the year after she left, her son sold the Biddle house to Dickinson College. Dickinson College discovered that she sold the contents of the house too, which was interesting. So what do you do with the contents of the Biddle? I would go crazy. I would love it. You know, what books do you have? You know, that kind of thing. What treasures do you have? But one of the things left was this chair. So this chair then became, you know, a hobo within the Dickinson College community, ending up in the Dickinson College archives, first at the, remember at that time also, there was the library of Dickinson College was also founded by Boslers. There's 2 Bosler libraries in Carlisle, one here that we're still in, and there was one over, still called Bosler Hall, in the next block. It is no longer a library. What you have is a Widener Spar library, and at the top southeast corner of that was the archives when I was a student there, and that's where I first discovered this magnificent chair. It has now since moved around, and fortunately is currently safe and treasured in Amy Ward's office. So that's where that artifact is. But you see how that artifact lets you into the Bosler cattle, what I call the cattle empire. But that cattle empire is also part of mining, railroads, banks, you name it, they were involved in it. It's just most obvious, and it's written about as a cattle empire. In 1881, which is the reason why I know this postdates that, a man named General Brisbane wrote a book called Bonanza of Beef, and it was a promotional of this is the future of America. We're going to raise beef to feed the world and so forth. He called John Herman Bosler a cattle king of the prairie. He listed 4 names, and John Herman was the largest holder of anyone in the cattle industry in the West. I mean, when you look at the numbers that he drew up in '81, John Herman is about 4 or 5 times as many head of cattle as anyone else. Sometimes whole areas didn't amount to the cattle herd that John Herman was in charge of. Now, John Herman's not there on the horse, he's not there slapping the leather or anything, but he's the guy who makes it happen. He's the guy whose money provides it. This chair is emblematic of where the Bosler money was and where the Bosler passion and sense of fun and joie de vivre was in the 1880s in Carlisle. It was focused out west. The second artifact you already know about. It's the memorial window. What does the memorial window tell us that you don't already know? You know it's the story of the dutiful daughter of John Herman Bosler and Mary Bosler, who stayed at home, the late child, who took care of them, who was always there when her dad came home from her Western trips, and finally, probably amazed her uncles and so forth, all these wild, fun-loving Western guys now, by agreeing to marry a man named David Hooker, who was a member of the Bosler Empire. He in particular was out in California, part of that real estate growth that the Boslers represented. Remember, and I know I apologize for repeating the story, that she accompanied him out west, breaking the heart of her parents, because finally the nest was empty, and there she goes, our beloved daughter, yet she married into the firm, so it's okay. She contracts a mosquito bite in California, which eventually develops into a kidney infection, which develops into Bright's disease, and she's brought home to get well, even though there's no getting well from Bright's disease. I remembered today, and I don't know, this came out of the blue, this is what happens when your mind becomes both Swiss cheese and fly tape. Woodrow Wilson's first wife, Ellen, died of Bright's disease when he was president. And I was thinking, well, roughly that's about a little, a couple decades later, but there you are. It was that fatal that quickly. And when Lila died and broke the heart of the town, actually, because she was so beloved here in town, she was very detailed. Every little movement of her funeral service was recorded. I know the time in which she left her parents' house, the fact that it was taken down by horses in a undertaker's carriage to Ashland Cemetery, where all the Boslers are. And I can tell you that her uncle, James Williamson, he was not around. Uncle Joseph just came back in time. James Williamson died early, by the way. Whole nother story there. But Joseph just came back in time. It was at Easter. David, her husband, did not arrive till after the burial. David is not buried in Ashland. David disappears from the pages of history, which I think is intriguing. And I'm not quite sure I want to find out what happened to him. But it's one of those things perhaps someday I'll uncover it, or have someone else uncover it. This artifact, though, is intriguing to me. Remember, we looked at the symbolism of this, we looked at the practical usefulness, if there was any, and then we looked at the symbolic usefulness of it. The window, as many of you know, is basically a pretty picture now. It's a rather vague theological aspiration. It's not exactly Christian, but it does express a certainty of an afterlife, and it's done more as a consolation of grief. It's in no way a portrait of Lila. By the way, I love that close-up. It's in superb condition. And yes, I'll be taking solicitations for the reupholstery. Even the feet of the chair are still original and in great shape. This is Lila. The gorgeous, idealistic Burne-Jones is not Lila. It is not a memorial window in that it is a portrayal window. It's an abstract. And to me that's very important. They brought in an English writer to excerpt a poem of his. They brought in an English artist, premier artist of his day, Burne-Jones, who probably largely had an assistant that the stained glass is done on. It was contracted to a firm here in America. It was all to me slightly removed. As fond as I am of that thing, and I love it dearly, and I worked really hard when we built the new edition on this to make sure it was going to be protected. Both Linda Rice and I did this. It is an abstraction. It's removed. It's not Lila. It's what her family at the time wanted to think about Lila. But that's all it is. It means nothing to the town. It means nothing to you except for an appreciation of its beauty and perhaps remembering bits and pieces of the story. So that artifact points to the disappearance of the Boslers, frankly. And I know that's a radical thought. The third artifact is a letter from Joseph Bosler to Joe Stewart here in Carlisle in 1901. I have a copy of the full letter. It's written from Fullerton, Nebraska, which is in Nance County, Nebraska, which is sort of northeast. You could think of it as north of Lincoln, Pennsylvanians would cheerfully say, people in the area would cheerfully say, it's in the middle of nowhere. And I think a lot of Nebraskans would probably agree with you on that. A nice river flows through it. But it is a very lightly populated county to this day. And at the time, any part of Nebraska in 1901 was considered hot property to be developed as farmland. He wrote a long letter to Joseph Stewart here in Carlisle, and it's essentially three things. It's a recruiting letter. The land here is so awesome. It's so great. And I know I should be able to quote it, I've read it so many times. He talks about the amount of bushels per acre. My old friend, I have been here nearly a week, and every time I ride out in the country, I think of you and a few other of my Presbyterian friends. Remember, these people are all Second Presbyterians. I hesitated writing you, fearing your thoughts next Sunday about the time you receive this may dwell upon what I write you in place of Pastor Norcross's discourse. And he goes on, I will risk the run forever, and he describes how great the land is. He describes, I've been here for 17 years. This is what this area grows, corn, wheat, and oats. We all know at this time in Nebraska that corn is simply fed to cattle, because that's what you really have up in Nebraska. But you could sell wheat and oats, and he describes price per bushel, and he just compares it to Perry County. It's a wonderful kind of meaty letter, but at the same time it's a businessman's letter. And it maintains its ties to Carlisle, which is fascinating to me. He talks about his farm just down the road, or standing in a neighbor's farm, 800-acre farm, and looking at all the wheat growing around him and calculating how fast it takes to plant and what the harvest is and what the rain's like. And yet, he makes repeated references back to Cumberland County. He talks about how many bushels you get up in Perry County from a mutual friend of theirs. That to me is a clue that will pay off. He talks about land as investment. He talks about how much you pay now, how much he paid when he first came. And I looked up values. Land in Nance County has not appreciated terribly a lot in 125 years. Hasn't kept pace with inflation, let me tell you. But and for that reason, it's interesting. It's remained lightly populated for a reason. And coincidentally, this past year's crops, Nance County is one of 5 counties in Nebraska that had to get supplemental support payments from the Department of Agriculture because the crop failed. And that's something that Joseph does not mention to James Stewart, to Joe Stewart at the time. The hazards of climate on the Great Plains. So it's only investment. He does not talk about the house he's building. He does not talk about raising his family there. He is coming back home. And that's the rather critical point I began to think about in the Bosler family story. You have a tremendous commercial empire stretching from Carlisle to San Francisco. You have land and railroads and banks and insurance companies and just about every possible little capitalistic pie with Bosler fingers in it you can imagine. And yet, what is left now? All 4 brothers, John Herman, who really never left, he kept coming back so frequently, James Williamson, who is the one who had the greatest political ambitions, who died tragically young, whose former home is roughly where Orrstown Bank is, east of town here. Joseph, who was so excited to write this long letter about the possibilities of investment in Nebraska farmland, and George Morris, who was the youngest brother. I can imagine the grief he took. But he was involved in all of his other brothers' ventures. All of them came back to Carlisle. James Williamson probably had ambitions elsewhere, but he didn't have time to live them. He died at age 50. Not that the Boslers were a very long-lived clan, but he built this grand mansion, which no longer stands, and died before anybody else. It's interesting to me that the business ventures remained out west, and indeed, James Williamson's business ventures are the ones that remained out west longer than his brothers. There was a Bosler, Wyoming, it's sort of a ghost town. There even were Bosler cattle companies. There's very elements. There's sort of this really interesting, and there's descendants out west that Christine Musser has been in contact with and met and done research, and there's 92 cubic feet of Bosler archival material at the University of Wyoming. There's a lot of Boslers left out there, but you notice it seems far and far away. It doesn't seem to come ever back. And that's because all four brothers returned here. And I'm going to point to you the one element that marks the line. George Morris had a son named Abram. You notice that's named after the grandfather. Previously, when I've told the Bosler family story, always especially relating it to the library, because that's my life, right? I have added it, I've ended the story of the Boslers with the departure of Gertrude Bosler Biddle in 1945, leaving behind, mysteriously, the cattle chair in the house to be purchased and inherited by Dickinson College. Her death 5 years later, to me, signs it, really seals the deal. This almost coincides with the death of William Homer Ames, to bring it back to my first talk. He died in 1944. After her death, instead of J. Herman Bosler Memorial Library, we became officially, by action of the board, the Bosler Free Library. It wasn't until a history nut, me, hooked up with Linda, and we said to each other, we don't like the name Bosler Free Library. It sends the wrong message. Because this was after the tax and so forth. I mean, libraries aren't free, as you all know. So Linda and I got together and told the board, no, it's time to go back to the J. Herman Bosler Memorial Library. That's over 50 years went by before we restored the library's name to itself. But that previously always had been the end. I am rethinking that. I'm rethinking about Abram, the third generation. And I have to be careful about this now. It's really gripping me. I find myself haunted again by the suicide of Abram on December 26, 1930. He was 46 years old. He was George Morrison Bosler. He was the son of George Morris Bosler, the youngest of the children, and the grandson of Abram the patriarch. In other words, his uncles were John Herman, James Williamson, Joseph. The thing about Abram was the empire out west in 1930 had not really faded. It was very active. It sustained itself past that second generation of Boslers. It was a going concern. Abram was, and I say this as an amateur businessman of 40 years, a financial genius. This guy could do anything with money. Every bank, every deposit, every trust company, every charitable institution in Carlisle wanted Abram Bosler on its board because he had the golden touch. He was an extraordinarily sharp guy. married Grace Wood of, coincidence, Philadelphia, and had 4 lovely children, and just seemed to have the financial magic that all those Western Boslers still needed. The various Boslers out west still used Abram back east, who was not big for traveling out west. He liked it here. He built a beautiful home on the southeast corner of College and West High Street, catacorny across from his cousin Gertrude Bosler Biddle and her husband. It's the house now known as the Admissions Building. That's Abram Bosler's house. So those 2 Bosler houses and Bosler Hall, which is at the northeast corner of College and West High Street, are a little Bosler cluster, which to me is very exciting. As a Dickinson College grad, I think, it's still here, it's still real. So he was very comfortable there. He was extremely active in this area. He was a genius with money. Why did he kill himself at age 46 on December 26, 1930? The story that came out was that financial reverses, remember, crash of 29, the financial reverses had him severely worried, concerned, frantic, and he took his life. He shot himself in the head. He was left-handed, he lifted a gun to his left temple and killed himself on the 3rd floor in a small little bedroom while his family was in the house and while his various family relations were in the house. It's the day after Christmas. He had been to work earlier that day, and a telephone call came in. The butler of the house picked it up, told his wife that there's a phone call for Mr. Abram, and then they heard a gunshot. And they had to find out where that was. And they discovered the body, and he was dead instantly. Fortunately, he wasn't one of these mistaken attempted suicides. He killed himself. Why does that echo with me? I mean, not only is it a dramatic story, but you notice that it cuts off the West. He was the last connection. He was the one they all needed. And it stopped with Abram. His cousin's mother, Gertrude, had gone east to die, to Ardmore. There's east and west here. And with Abram, you break the bridge in between them. He's the last one. And the funny thing is that his 6-year-old daughter, remember they had 4 young children. His 6-year-old daughter was Mary Wood Bosler. And during the centennial, I went over to a table at a fundraiser and held the hands of Mary Wood Bosler Stewart here in Carlisle. She was here to celebrate the centennial of Bosler. I had no idea at the time, 25 years ago, that I was holding the hands that once wrapped their arms around their daddy's legs to greet him when he would come home from work, from all his banking roles and all his banking duties. His obituary even mentions the fondness he had for his children and how he loved to play with them and devote time to them. And I had no idea when I held the hands and made pleasant talk with Mary that I was that connected to the man who was the linchpin, the nexus of the Western Bosler Empire and the Eastern Bosler clan, what arose in all this. It's complicated. That's what I said at Presbytery about history being complicated. I do not buy the fact that he had financial reverses. I have done a forensic analysis of his estate. It was in great shape. In 1930, I could not imagine anyone else in Carlisle having a more solid financial security than Abram Bosler. I have been on a long quest for trying to tease out why such a man would have killed himself in the worst possible circumstances. But whatever its meaning, whatever its reasoning, it snapped the cord. The end is not when Gertrude Bosler Biddle leaves. The end is when Abram kills himself. Now where does that leave? And this is the epilogue to the epilogue. Where does that leave when Abram is a severance, it's a departure, it's a farewell? Where does that leave the institutions that these people created? A lot of them anymore. This does. The J. Herman Bosler Memorial Library still exists. Why? James Williamson was so proud and cocky, typical James Williamson, when Joseph was, sorry. I always get Joseph and James Williamson mixed up. Joseph was so cocky when the building was founded that he said, we're giving you an endowment that'll last a lifetime in the library. That $22,000 lasted approximately till the Depression, then it was gone. It was nothing. Homer dies. Abram's gone. Gertrude's gone. Mary Kirk Bosler, who was so generous, she was the one who gave the library steam heat when it needed it. All these Boslers are gone. Now, much later, during our centennial, we charmed and tickled the Ashcrafts and various other Boslers, and Mary, and we got a little money here and there, but all that money was gone. How did this library continue to exist as a Bosler entity? It's because it existed as a community entity. You, stretching back forth almost 100 years now, are the reason the library is still here. It's so funny to me. We honor Bosler. I get excited by Bosler. I could talk about Boslers for evenings. We have an abstraction, a beautiful window in the next building. We have a name on a beautiful building that we restored. We name things, right and left, and we talk about them. But what happens to the story when the storytellers are gone? The community